Bet the Board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Fuhrman.
Welcome into the Bet the Board podcast, college football playoff edition. We now know the 12 teams that'll be vying for a college football national championship in the newly expanded format. All the drama officially in the rearview mirror about the teams that are in, the teams that are out, and the teams with the easier paths to being able to make this all happen. I'm your host, Todd Fuhrman, joined as always by my esteemed colleagues and co-host on this fine program, Brad Powers and Payne Insider. Gentlemen, there's no Alabama, there's no Miami, there's a little bit of SMU, and Clemson off death's door into the playoff should make for an interesting opening set of 4 games that we'll have on the slate this weekend.
Yeah, maybe not the name brands that the TV executives wanted, but still going to be interesting in the first year. And I think the most interesting aspect is we get 4 playoff games at college stadiums where college football, in my opinion, separates itself. So, the pageantry of a home stadium on a college campus. So I'm excited about it. But obviously, Alabama, Notre Dame probably would have moved the needle a little bit more than a home state battle between the two.
Although don't look at ticket prices in South Bend. A tough ticket to get for IU, who hasn't played Notre Dame for almost an eternity, and we'll get to more of that there. But Payne, your overall sentiment in terms of the way things were put together before we get into the games themselves?
I'll double down with Brad's assessment. They're having these games with home field advantages. It's kind of what college football is all about. And we're in a time now where college football does not look the same. Having these played in home environments kind of brings you back to some big games that were super meaningful years ago. In terms of the actual entrance, was there really anything controversial?
Nope, not really.
Not really. Nope.
Relative to last year? I mean, we're sitting here fighting for 3 lost teams. We're sitting here fighting for 2 lost teams that required a reversed call and a Hail Mary, or a team that was losing to 25 at Cal. Miami's easily a 4-loss team. Alabama, yes, they have some good wins, but boy, some of those losses are ugly. So there wasn't really anything controversial here.
Agree.
No, I think that they did everything that they could. Teams earned their way in. The only thing I'd like to see change going forward, not that I have any problems with the teams that earn buys as conference champions, just reseed the field. There's nothing right about a team like Oregon having arguably one of the more difficult roads as the number 1 seed, taking on the winner of Ohio State, Tennessee, and looking at the Penn States and Texases who lose their conference championship games and yet actually benefit from that. But hopefully there are some fixes in place going forward and teams get rewarded, especially if you run the table or you win the most difficult leagues in the country.
That's the biggest gripe. That's by far the biggest gripe.
That's the single biggest gripe that I have.
Yeah, I think that's actually well said, and we've talked about it, but that's the big thing. Now, the reseeding will favor the best teams with potentially a couple more losses versus conference champions from lesser conferences, so it'll be interesting to see how that gets divvied up. I think we'll talk about a couple of these games, but one team we were trying to fade and don't fully believe in has one of the easiest paths. So that's kind of been the gist of this season, and you can't capitalize when you think there's going to be an opportunity. Poof, no opportunity.
No, there is nothing in front of us right now. We'll see how all the matchups play out. But 4 games that we do know, at least on paper, we'll cover in great detail around here. And the festivities will kick off Friday night in South Bend, where Notre Dame is now just a touchdown favorite as they'll play host to the Indiana Hoosiers. Total on the game, 51. This number down a touch from where it opened up, kind of in no man's land, as high as 8.5, 9. 2 programs in the state of Indiana, separated by a grand total of 200 miles, meeting for the first time since 1991. 1991. Notre Dame beat the Hoosiers back then 49-27, and it's just the second time these teams have played since 1959. As far as what Indiana and Notre Dame have accomplished this season, they rank top 2 in the FBS in points per game differential. Both resumes leave a little bit to be desired, and I think a lot of questions about strength of schedule for both programs will have to be answered this weekend. Indiana, though, deserves a world of credit for the largest year-over-year increase in point per game differential by any team in FBS history, going all the way back to 1978. Program record 11 wins in their first college football playoff appearance in pursuit of their first ever national title. Hell, their last bowl win came back in 1991 when they won the now defunct Copper Bowl, just 1-71 all-time versus AP top 5 opponents. That lone win coming against Purdue back in 1967. Meanwhile, for Notre Dame, third college football playoff appearance under Marcus Freeman. It looked like this campaign was going to get off the rails when you lose at home early in the year as nearly a 4-touchdown favorite against NIU. Credit to the Fighting Irish for rebounding and running the table. They've also, though, won 6 straight games versus AP-ranked teams, the longest active FBS streak, and they've done so in dominant fashion during that particular stretch. This is an Irish team putting together its best football, arguably, at the right point in the season. And Brad, one of the questions I think that Notre Dame had to answer coming into the year was how Riley Leonard was going to look as the facilitator. We knew that this team was going to be able to run the football if their offensive line gelled. They surprisingly put together a run as a Joe Moore semifinalist. We've seen the two-headed monster in the backfield, which Jadarian Price and Jeremiah Love can do, and Riley Leonard will provide a challenge for Indiana that they haven't faced all season, and it wasn't lost on a lot of their defensive minds, saying that his legs will be an element that they haven't had to contend with when you go through a list of the mobile quarterbacks, so to speak, that Indiana has faced this year. Nothing really stands out. Can make the case that Northwestern with their mobile quarterback provided a little bit, but other than that, it's Ethan Garbers for UCLA way back in September. Notre Dame's offense against an Indiana defense that, while they don't have a ton of household names, has exceeded everyone's expectations more often than not in 2024.
Yeah, I think you got into the key matchup here, and that being the two teams' strength. Notre Dame's rushing offense, I mean, that by far is their strength on that side of the ball against the Indiana defense. That, at least statistically, basic stats, number 1 in the country in rush defense. But I also thought you touched on a good point. Strength of schedule for both teams leaves a hell of a lot to be desired here, and I'll get to that in a second. But obviously, when you look at Notre Dame, that three-headed monster, when you include Leonard at quarterback in that rushing attack, Jeremiah Love, Jadarian Price. Jeremiah Love, and this isn't the fan in me saying this, I just, from watching ball, I think he's the most talented running back in college football. I'm not saying he's better, overall back right now than Ashton Genty, but just from a talent aspect, he does things from an explosiveness and a little bit of wiggle that just you don't see in the rest of college football. Now, with that being said, the concern for Jeremiah Love would be got banged up, did not finish the USC game. Even though it's 3 weeks since that game, when open practice was seen by the media on Sunday, he's wearing a knee brace. Will he still have the same explosiveness that makes him, one of the best in college football? Remains to be seen. I mean, I thought he was cutting well, but I didn't see him, sprint 60, 70 yards down the field with that brace on. Price is obviously a good 1A in the backfield, and Riley Leonard's lived up to expectations as far as being the runner. And then some. The problem with Riley Leonard was at the start of the season, did not keep in mind coming off of injury last year. They got re-injured so he didn't have spring, wasn't healthy, and really the passing game was going to be a weakness for the team regardless if he hit the ground running or not, because the wide receivers for Notre Dame just average at best, probably the weakest wide receiver unit of any team probably in this playoff. So he had some settling in to do, didn't look the part the first couple of weeks, but since the Northern Illinois game, just like the rest of the team, I mean, he's taking care of the football. There's not much more you can ask him. He's completing 67.5% since that game, 16-3 ratio, top 15 in QBR. So, I've been pleased with this play. I think you mentioned the offensive line. I think that's been the biggest reason why Notre Dame's been able to rebound from the Northern Illinois game and win 10 straight. And there was an offensive line that came into the season. Kyle Field, 6 combined career starts. Obviously had some success late in that game, but it was kind of a mismatch unit because they suffered even more injuries during the season. I think what really helped them is Billy Schrout was one of their, expected starters. He plays early in the season, gets banged up, misses 3 games. But since he came back against Navy, this Notre Dame rushing offense, even though it hasn't faced the toughest competition, I mean, it's looked as good as anybody in the country, at least running the football. So 7 yards per carry there. Their best offensive lineman, right tackle, Wagner, just, been solid all season. Getting into some advantages, though, for Indiana, because this is the best defense that Notre Dame has faced this season. I'm anxious to see what kind of push that Indiana possibly can get up front, because there's 2 guys that really impressed me watching the tape. Obviously, Kamara off the edge, 60 pressures did so far this season. That's second in the nation, 10 sacks. They have a 315-pounder in the middle, the Kent State transfer, C.J. West, that impressed me. And even in the game against Ohio State was still getting some solid push there. Notre Dame's not overly, big on either side, and Payne will be talking about it on the other side, where I think there's maybe some opportunity for Indiana's defense to create some havoc. What I fully expect Indiana to do is let's get as many guys in the box as possible. I think they got to feel confident that their corners, led by D'Angelo Pons, even though he's 5'9", 165, they got to feel pretty confident that they can play man-to-man against this Notre Dame wide receiver unit that leaves a lot to be desired. Put as many guys up at the line of scrimmage as possible, and whoever wins that battle, if Notre Dame gets the best of Indiana and Indiana can't stop the run, then obviously it's going to be a long night for the Hoosiers. If they can get some stops and force Riley Leonard in some known passing situations, that's where, Indiana maybe can force some rare turnovers from Riley Leonard. I will say another thing that I'm looking at here, X factor for Notre Dame was going to be their tight end, in my opinion, Mitchell Evans. All-American last season, gets hurt in the Duke game, tore his ACL, wasn't healthy, obviously missed spring, wasn't even healthy at the start of the season to the point where he didn't even play in the A&M game. He is off his best game of the season, though, in the finale against USC. Now he's got an extra 3 weeks. I think Notre Dame is going to feature not only Mitchell Evans, but the tight ends more than in some of the, maybe in any game so far this season. So that's something to keep an eye on. But what I'm getting at here is I'm pretty even on this one. I don't see a solid edge for either team. And I think it basically comes down to, even though here we are, game 13 for both. And I know they're good, but I don't know if either unit's great because of questionable strength of schedule.
BP, how much can we take away from the way Indiana held up in the trenches against Ohio State? Arguably the best litmus test for the caliber of opponent they're going to face here. I mean, they didn't look overwhelmed when it came to stopping the run, other than one explosive that we saw from Travion Henderson. Down to down, the Buckeyes weren't able to have a tremendous amount of success ripping off some of those long runs that we've grown accustomed to seeing from the Irish over the last couple months of the season.
So obviously Ohio State more talented than Notre Dame, especially on the perimeter. However, the Buckeyes banged up on the offensive line. I would take Notre Dame's offensive line, even though it was perceived to be a weakness coming in the season. I would take the current form of Notre Dame's offensive line over Ohio State. I also think Riley Leonard's a much better runner than Will Howard. So I was impressed big time that they were able to hold up at the point of attack in that game. But I just think this Notre Dame rushing offense, but with the 3 heads there, is just, it's kind of a different animal that I don't think Indiana's faced anybody near as close to that. In fact, they haven't faced a top 50 rushing offense this entire season. Notre Dame's top 10. So there's some questions. Even though they're number 1 in the country in defending the run, they really haven't faced anybody anywhere near the caliber of Notre Dame's rush offense.
It's a great point. You look at some of the counting stats, and you do have to adjust even after 12 data points for some of these programs for strength of schedule, and Indiana will have their hands full if the Irish are able to run the football downhill. Payne, on the other side of the ball, Indiana's offense, second in the FBS, averaging more than 43 points per game, but they did show some struggles against the 2 best defenses they faced this season, Ohio State and Michigan. It was the Wolverines completely shutting down Indiana's offense in the second half, used a lot of stunts and twists along the defensive line with NFL caliber players in that regard. Against Ohio State, they were able to run the ball with some level of success, but the passing game was more or less an afterthought. Protection has been one of the strengths, at least when you look at some of the offensive line numbers, but they did give up 9 of their 18 sacks against the aforementioned big boys defensively. in the Big Ten. Curtis Rourke didn't perform great in either of those games, a little bit more of a game manager. We'll see exactly what the Hoosiers can provide with a 1-2 punch in the backfield. And defensively for Notre Dame, I mean, look, this is a group allowing less than 2 touchdowns per game, third in the FBS, entering bowl season. No offense has scored more than 3 touchdowns in a game against them in a 24-game span. That includes Ohio State twice, Clemson twice, Louisville twice, a Riley Leonard-led Duke team at the time. Notre Dame's defense against Indiana's offense. Al Golden get the edge, or you think Coach Cignetti and company can come up with a few wrinkles here?
Yeah, I mean, that's ultimately the big talking point. And you'll hear it everywhere you go. You won't be able to escape it this week when Indiana's offense stepped up in class against Michigan and Ohio State. They really couldn't spell offense. The script looked good initially, right, against Michigan, but the second half, 26% success rate, and then minus 0.32 EPA per pass against Ohio State the following week, to your point about Curtis Rourke not being able to get into a groove there. I think that's understood, right? The Hoosiers weren't good, but I also think you do have to call into question Notre Dame's defensive schedule. Like, who have they played? What competent passing attack have the Irish faced this season? It was really only Louisville, right? And when it was all said and done, Notre Dame ended up playing multiple backups, right? They ended up getting A&M's backup, FSU's backup, Georgia Tech's backup, faced 2 option offenses, an Army and Navy, and then the rest of the schedule is Virginia, Stanford, Purdue, NIU, and Miami, Ohio. All offenses outside the top 85. That average efficiency rank of those last 5 offenses I just listed off, 104th. So if you're going to talk about Indiana struggling when they stepped up in class, you do have to at least point out that Notre Dame has not played a soul on offense. So I just think it's a point worth mentioning when we just viewed what transpired against USC, one of the probably the most respectable pass offense Notre Dame has faced this season, and USC with a backup QB none of us really like, and Jordan Mailata shredded the Notre Dame secondary. And I know Al Golden came out this week and took blame for the USC game, claimed what he ran was maybe too sophisticated, and I understand the situation was really difficult for the Irish, right? You play Army in New York one week and then face a completely different style of offense in USC on the West Coast the following week. Maybe some questions of fatigue there. We talked before the show. Brad made a great point about Freeman saying that was the most physical game they had played all season against Army. But guys are running wide open through that Notre Dame secondary. And sure, some of the passing numbers look a little different because in terms of yardage, based upon how much USC possessed it late, but they did have a 52% passing success rate. Notre Dame allowed a 33% success rate on passing downs to Jordan Mailata. I wonder if Notre Dame can get pressure on Curtis Rourke, because you mentioned it, Todd. Nebraska, Michigan, and Ohio State were able to pressure Rourke on 37% of his dropbacks, turn that into 10 sacks. Aside from left tackle Carter Smith, this is, a makeshift offensive line for the Hoosiers that's, I think, played better than the sum of the parts, right, against lesser competition. We have holdovers that weren't very good or getting a ton of snaps. There's guys that were brought in from other programs that couldn't quite start, and that's basically the compilation of this Indiana offensive line past Carter Smith. Rourke does have a tendency to hold on to the ball when he gets pressured, takes a sack on nearly 26% of pressure, so he's got to be a little bit more decisive, be a little bit more confident. Notre Dame, from at least what we saw in the USC game, Al Golden elected to challenge those USC receivers. He walked up his secondary. Christian Gray, Xavier Watts, Leonard Moore, they are fantastic. That's, at least on paper, one of the better trios in the entire country. Now, based upon guys transferring out and getting injured, there's only 3 scholarship cornerbacks on this roster, so God forbid any of those guys go down in this game. But they allow Al Golden to keep more guys in the box because of their ability to cover one-on-one. That really, I think, saves a defensive line that's a little bit of, seem to be a little light in the britches. A lot of guys 280, 290 along that defensive line. Indiana has some guys outside that can win one-on-one. I would think with nearly 3 weeks to prepare, we believe Cignetti is a a really competent coach, obviously. I think he's probably going to have a lot of man beaters put in. Crossers, rubs, meshes, picks, if Notre Dame's going to walk their corners up and play man coverage. I think when we kind of view Indiana this season, we kind of think of them as this like high-flying passing attack, but they like to play bully ball too. They want to be balanced. Their throw rate is about 2.5% over expectation. They want to get Ellison going, and I think that's been a vital component for the Hoosiers offense. Notre Dame, as I mentioned, doesn't have a ton of beef up front, and they like to play a lot of base with three backers, and they can get away with it a little bit because of those corners. Howard Cross appears good to go, and not just 20 snaps good to go, but probably a full allotment here. Notre Dame's front, though, outside the top 80 in defensive line yards allowed, havoc created, and tackles for loss. If Ellison gets going on the ground, this game will, I think, be a little uncomfortable for Notre Dame. USC's backs, Joyner, Jackson, and Marks, 8.5 yards a carry. If the weather holds up and there isn't any crazy wind coming off the lake, I'm starting to get the vibe Indiana's offense will perform better than the simple expectation of they did zip and pip against Ohio State and Michigan. I don't think they'll look the same if weather conditions are good on Saturday relative to how they faced those two teams.
You have to think that there can be a little bit more multiple than what Notre Dame can do in terms of showing a little bit of a dynamic passing attack. And to your point, talking about the strength of this Notre Dame defense, which has been their secondary, and how some of those players have performed. We'll see exactly if they're up for the task in this particular meeting. A final thing on this game, Payne, and I don't want to cut you off if you had anything else you wanted to add, but I was going to throw it back to BP about the number. Do we think the next move we see it leak back to 7.5, or do we think there is a chance that Notre Dame's number shortens a little bit more and we go from 7 down below the key into that 6.5 range?
I don't know if I'm the guy to ask on that one. I think 7's a pretty fair number. I mean, if we want to get into decimal points, I made it 7.2. But it seems like I'm a little bit on an island with some little bit of optimism on Notre Dame in this matchup. The market's saying that Indiana's the right side.
I think anytime you ask that question and we're around a key number, the next move is the big one, right? We're recording in no man's land Wednesday morning, so I would guess Thursday evening, Friday morning, when limits start to increase, that will get answered. We're in some untenuous, right? Like if you want Indiana, there's plenty of 7.5 out there. If you want Notre Dame, there's plenty of 7. And that's why it's always easier for professional bettors to win on their own than it is to give stuff out, because the ability to shop around. The sentiment that I have heard is that there is going to be a little bit of a battle on this game. Anything 7.5 or better is Indiana. If this, God forbid, somehow got below the 7, there would be some buyback from another group. If the weather holds up here, boy, it sounded like Brad thinks Notre Dame's offense can get going, and it sounds like Indiana is going to have, at least from my perspective, a little bit of a better chance here than they performed against Michigan and Ohio State. But we've seen under money, and it's been around that key number of 51. We're now down to 50.5 a couple places. So this is, if Brad wasn't in attendance, I mean, it's Notre Dame all day. That's been my X factor in this game. Now that I know Brad's going to this game, I think I could only look one way at Indiana.
Brad, what is the infamous ATS record when you're in attendance for Fighting Irish football before we close the book on this one and move on to Saturday?
2-15 against the spread, failing to cover by 7 points.
Which were the two covers is what I want to know.
Oh, wow. I don't know off the top of my head. I could tell you one was against my alma mater, Bowling Green. They won by, favored by like 45, won by 50-ish.
We just broke this game down for 20 minutes. We just needed to ask that question at the top. And we could have moved on.
Apparently I buried the lead. But I had to try and have all sorts of build-up to the ultimate crescendo at the end. So Notre Dame and Indiana, a great way to kick things off on Friday before we get into a trio of games on Saturday. That'll start at Beaver Stadium in Happy Valley, Pennsylvania. Penn State, an 8.5-point favorite pretty much everywhere you look right now. Total more or less 54 painted across the board. AccuWeather forecast projects a high of 29 degrees in State College on Saturday. Could feel more like 22 degrees. The average kickoff temperature this year for the SMU Mustangs, a robust 72.6 degrees. Rhett Lashley was asked how weather could play a role for his team. His response, this is going to be different. It'll probably be 25 or somewhat around there. Here's the deal. They're playing in the same weather we are. They got to play in it just like we do. I don't think they've played a game on December 21st at home before either, so I'm not sure it is a massive advantage. Well, we'll see how those boys from Texas fare. They did say that the 33 or 34 degree closing temperatures in the ACC championship game they thought could prepare them for what they'll encounter this coming weekend. SMU seeking its first win against an AP Top 5 team since 1980 at Texas. Their loss versus Clemson snapped a 9-game winning streak, was the fourth longest active win streak in the FBS, and their both losses for SMU came against the only two ranked opponents they've faced. However, on the flip side for James Franklin and Penn State, we know against AP Top 15 matchups, not exactly a gaudy record by any stretch of the imagination, going 4-14. Penn State 0-6 against the number, last 6 games against ranked teams, most recently dropping the Big Ten championship against Oregon, where they took money from 3.5 down to 3. James Franklin, though, excited about the kind of atmosphere that can be created with more than 100,000 Penn State fans in attendance for this one. And Brad, SMU this year started the season with Preston Stone under center, made the decision to go to Kevin Jennings because of the mobility he provided behind a makeshift offensive line. Once Jennings took over, the offensive line started to gel. There was a lot discussed about how this group wasn't looking to try and hit the explosives, but more or less claiming there was a dog at the dinner table mentality. Sometimes it's a scrap and sometimes it's an opportunity to feast. They'll go up against the Penn State defense that, when they've stepped up in class, really has left an awful lot to be desired in terms of getting off the field on third downs, ability to slow down dynamic passing attacks. But after playing Oregon, SMU will be a step down in class. Mustangs offensively led by Kevin Jennings against the Penn State defense headlined by Abdul Carter. Who gets the edge on this side of the ball?
Yeah, I'm going with a slight edge here to Penn State's defense. Penn State defense that I generally think is overrated, but I'm not sure that SMU's strengths are going to be able to take advantage of Penn State's weaknesses. And starting with that SMU offense, I think, again, we're correct in saying that the move to Jennings was the correct move. Since week 4, fourth best passing grade in the country since then. Obviously gives him a little bit of mobility. He's not a runner anywhere near like Riley Leonard for Notre Dame is, but we saw even in the game against Clemson late in the game when he needed to scramble, and needed to scramble a lot because that SMU offensive line leaves a lot to be desired, but he was able to at least get his wide receiver some extra time and make the throws when need be. I think the most underrated player on maybe even the entire team is their running back. Brashard Smith doesn't get enough credit. He almost has 1,300 yards. He's one of just 3 running backs in the entire country, ranks in the top 25 in both rushing and receiving grade. The other 2, you might have heard of them, Cam Scadaboo, Jeremiah Love. So Smith, it's imperative to get some semblance, trying to get some semblance of some balance here. They've struggled with it, though. Last 4 weeks of the season, SMU's only averaged 130 rushing yards per game. Worst stretch of the season for them. If they can't run against Penn State and they're one-dimensional and just got to throw, obviously that's not going to lead itself to a lot of success here. The wide receiver core, they don't have an alpha. It's a very balanced and deep group, but a couple of key guys have been out. Bailey in the slot, obviously R.J. Maryland. They played the last half of the season without him. I will say, the Clemson game, I was impressed with the backup, Matthew Hibner. Got a lot of production for them out of that tight end position. Here we are, another playoff team where I question the strength of schedule, especially the opposing defenses that SMU's faced. Only one top 20 defense, BYU. Well, how did SMU do in that game? Well, it was by far their worst performance of the season. 15 points, 261 yards. They had no other game less than 28, less than 375 on the season. So, and obviously Penn State's better than BYU. So I'm concerned there. I'm still concerned about the offensive line. You flip on the Clemson tape at the start of the game, you're like, oh my goodness, why didn't I bet at Clemson way more here? I mean, it just is just like we thought. Clemson's defensive line's going to eat here. And that was the case for, 2.5, 3 quarters. But once, Jennings started running around at the end, I mean, they were starting to wear on that Clemson defense at the end of the game. And we'll see if they can do something similar here against a Penn State defense that, basic stats say they're clearly top 10. Yards per play, yards per game, points per game. Even some of the more advanced metrics, EPA per rush, EPA per dropback, both in the top 10. But you kind of mentioned it. Against some of the better offenses they faced this season, USC was able to gash them on the ground. How about nearly 8 yards per carry? Buckeyes ran for 176. I go to that final drive where they ran 12 straight times and were able to run out the clock on them. Oregon last week. I mean, 2 weeks ago, to talk about missed opportunities, Oregon team total that I kind of liked over. It was, no doubt about it was, you went over, 5 minutes left in the second quarter. So is SMU as talented as any of those three? No. But it's still, if I had to stack rank them on the season, this is the third or fourth best, offense that Penn State's seen. I do think Abdul Carter is going to get some opportunities to impact the game. If you look at wins above average, the most valuable edge rusher in college football, 10 sacks for him. I expect him to have a big day. And obviously he's not alone there. I mean, up front, you got Dennis Sutton, Durant, Kobe King at linebacker. I expect them to be able to cover the SMU wide receivers and play some man here and get after the passer. The question I have for Penn State is obviously SMU likes to play in some space, and Penn State has struggled playing in space. SC, Oregon, number 82 tackling grade. So there'll be some opportunities for SMU, but to me, it's just imperative. If they can't run the football with Smith, and Penn State can tee off with a pass rush, I certainly give the edge to Penn State here.
Brad, before I go to Payne and we get his take on how the Penn State offense will match up against the Mustangs defense, coaching narrative always plays a big role around Penn State in big games with James Franklin, and typically it's been the maize and blue and the scarlet and gray that have been nightmare fodder for not just him, but all of Penn State fans that can't seem to get over the hump. How much concern do you have about Franklin's ability in games of this magnitude, knowing what's at stake? And Penn State has the weight of the world and expectations playing in front of their home crowd that if they don't get off to a quick start, things could turn relatively quickly.
Well, you're on top of it, as always, Todd. Last I checked, SMU's not Ohio State or Michigan. They're not in the top 5. I think Franklin's terrible record is against, top 5 opponents? And he's favored by more than a touchdown. So, yeah, it's a big game. It's a playoff game, but he usually, against these types of opponents, he usually takes care of business. So I don't think it's a big factor. I think the bigger, not off the field factors will be how does SMU handle the atmosphere as far as the weather conditions and also the overall atmosphere. I mean, how many times in the last 40 years has SMU played in a game like this? They obviously were tight at the start of the ACC championship game before they settled in, but I mean, it's a bit, half-empty stadium at a new, quote-unquote neutral site compared to 100,000 whiteout. I'm kind of more concerned on the SMU side on how they'll handle expectation.
It's a great point, and one I'm very interested to see early on because, at least to me, it almost felt like SMU appeared to have the weight of the world and expectations on their shoulders in the Clemson game, knowing that there was a chance if they lost that game, they could be out of the college football playoff. Now they can embrace that underdog mentality, play a little bit looser and freer, but going to need to get off to a quick start to force Penn State to chase. And Payne, if Penn State is forced to chase in this game, we've seen a real mixed bag from this team offensively, and look, I know it's not going to be something that's going to impact the point spread, but losing a backup quarterback that was a key component of what Penn State wanted to do to change the pace, use him in short yardage, could be a little bit of something that Andy Kotelnicki and James Franklin, of course, didn't envision facing them as a potential obstacle in a game like this or for a deep playoff run. We all know what Tyler Warren is capable of doing, both as a receiver, as a runner. I think we all share a similar sentiment that he was unfairly given the Mackey Award over Harold Fannin of Bowling Green. before Penn State, they did get healthier in the backfield, and that was one thing over the last 17 days or so leading up to this game that has been mentioned multiple times. Katron Allen and Nicholas Singleton starting to look like the running backs that they were early in September. Singleton goes for 100 yards for the first time since week 2 in the loss against Oregon, and this is an SMU defense that, while they've been good against the run and appear stout in the trenches, a major step up in class, but at the same time, the one area where Clemson was able to exploit the SMU defense was on the outside. And last I checked, Penn State doesn't exactly boast elite-level wide receivers or game breakers on the perimeter.
So this was the game that I was referencing at the top of the show. And if you've listened long enough, you already know most of my thoughts here. The one team we wanted to fade that was all but guaranteed a playoff game was Penn State. But they get matched up with the one team we were closest to having our biggest position on in conference championship week, right? It was Clemson. We were 3 flat, just never became widely available. We wanted to fade SMU. And so here we have 2 fade teams playing each other. Made the game 5.5 on a neutral, add one of the largest home field advantages in all of college football for Penn State, white out at night, fair price. I actually came into this game with no preconceived opinions and thought maybe Penn State was going to be the side. So you now have to find something, because the price looks fair beyond that number, to create a large enough edge, right? A piece of information, an injury not being factored into the number, a matchup. I actually think Brad's side of the ball has all of the variance, and he hit it perfectly. That side will dictate the outcome more than my side, because most of Penn State's defensive metrics, even adjusted for schedule, look great. The problem is the 2 data points Brad mentioned, sticking out against competent spread offenses. And I would even go back to Bowling Green. And then we saw what Oregon did. That's what SMU also operates out of. They're a spread offense. We've touched on Penn State's defense, especially on the ground. Tom Allen runs this base defense, 7 in the box. Penn State literally goes from a top 20 unit stopping the run against traditional offenses in yards per rush allowed before first contact. They fall all the way outside the top 80 stopping the run against spread offenses. Penn State allows nearly 2 yards more per rush before first contact when they get spread out. And so if SMU can avoid 3rd and long situations because the ground game's working, it lessens the impact of Abdul Carter. And he is an absolute game wrecker. 18% pressure rate on pass rush snaps, and SMU doesn't have a Josh Connerly. Okay? So that, to me, by far outweighs anything on my side of the ball. But in terms of Penn State's offense, I think they find success. You're always going to trust Andy Kotelnicki, especially with extra time to prepare. I think the question I have is the one that you had, Todd. Like, how does Andy go about attacking SMU? Because the way to attack SMU isn't necessarily how Penn State has gone about things. I mean, SMU's defense has been better across the board when they face a traditional style offense. So I'm interested to see if Andy goes a little bit more spread offense himself. SMU's run defense is at its best against these heavy box run types, top 15 in yards per rush allowed before first contact. And you're looking at a little bit of a shakeup along that offensive line the past few games. Nolan Rucci, right, hasn't been as good creating push at right tackle as Anthony Dunca. So if Penn State underachieves in this spot because Allen and Singleton didn't get enough touches, right, the Sunday morning quarterbacks are going to be out in full force. But you really want to attack SMU through the air. But I look at SMU, their pressure rate against traditional drop-back throw games like Penn State's, it's top 25 in the country. But they're outside the top 75 getting pressure against any other style of throwing concept. SMU secondary, extremely vulnerable, but more so against quicker throws. And you never want to take Aller's specialty away, which is, him dialing up that deep ball, that calculated deep shot, because he's elite on throws 15-plus yards, number 1 in the country. But the quicker, short to intermediate stuff has really decimated SMU's pass defense. So it's always tough to change your offense, but I think with 2+ weeks to prepare, Andy can kind of put an emphasis on using more of the concepts that give SMU trouble rather than playing into their hands. I think he's going to have to. You mentioned Prabula at the top. Is that a factor that's going to move the number on the screen? No, but I think you always want to have that extra out. You always want to have that wrinkle in your game in case something is not going as planned.
Or if there's an injury, I would assume.
Right. That too, obviously. But the other thing here is I know they have multiple weeks to prepare, but if you have to spend 10, 15 hours on Pribula and some of his possessions, it's 10, 15 hours that aren't spent focusing on Drew Allar and the other parts of Penn State. So from that point, it is a factor, right? If he's able to go out there and pick up a key first down that extends a drive that you end up going to score on, like it's more than maybe the spread could comprehend. So it's nice to have that extra out. But I think it's Brad's side of the ball that's the impact here. If SMU can get out there and run the ball and spread Penn State out, this is a little bit of a trickier game than maybe meets the surface.
And a game where bookmakers are going to have plenty of luxury to move this number one way or another as we sit in the definition of no man's land at 8.5. The total will be interesting. Pending the weather forecast, if we tick up to the key number of 55 or we see some under money flow in, but it hasn't really budged thus far. So you have to imagine books feel pretty comfortable with the numbers that they've set on a game between unfamiliar opponents and in SMU's case played in a little bit of unfamiliar territory. The middle game on Saturday, gents, Clemson on the road at Texas, and it's Texas being bet up from where they opened. We'll call it an 11-point favorite out to that 12.5 range. Total has come down a touch. Openers as high as 53, now down to 51.5. What I found surprising, it's the first ever meeting between these programs, but I guess it just goes to show, even with blue bloods in college football, if you're stepping outside a conference, meetings aren't all that frequent. Clemson's head coach Dabo Swinney and Georgia's head coach Kirby Smart, the only two active FBS head coaches with a national championship on their resume already. Clemson will be headed to Austin seeking the largest upset in college football playoff history. Double-digit favorites are 8-0 straight up in the CFP in the very short history. Just the fourth time that Clemson will enter a game as a double-digit dog under Dabo. One of them, of course, happened earlier this season, back in week 1. They were absolutely blasted by Georgia in the season opener, but a level of familiarity and a homecoming of sorts for Cade Klubnik. Played his high school football in Austin, Texas, and also matched up against Quinn Ewers in a high school state championship back during the COVID era. So no level of familiarity between those two. Clemson, 7th college football playoff appearance, made the CFP every season from 2015 to 2020. Texas, meanwhile, right back in the college football playoff after coming up short in last year's game against Washington. It'll be the first time hosting an ACC team going all the way back to 2001. Brad, Texas offensively, it's been the storyline that everyone has followed. Quinn Ewers, how short a leash he could have in this spot. Would Steve Sarkisian go to Arch Manning if Quinn struggled early in this game? But against the Clemson defense, this feels like a little bit of a breath of fresh air. It's a far cry from a Clemson stop unit we've grown accustomed to in the past. And whether you're looking at the efficiency numbers or the counting stats, this is far from an elite unit that Texas is going to face in familiar surroundings in a de facto home game.
Yeah, certainly an edge to Texas's offense here. The question is, how big of an edge is it going to be? And I think ultimately it comes down to whether or not they take care of the football, a la Quinn Ewers, who has struggled taking care of the football, to say the least, especially lately. 17 turnover-worthy plays for him this season. I question whether or not he's totally dialed in, because every time I turn around, I'm hearing transfer rumors from Quinn Ewers. So I agree that there could be a little bit of a leash here on him. But the other issue is red zone for Texas, number 92 in the country as far as scoring percentage. So if they play a clean game and take advantage of their opportunities in the red zone, boy, this could be a significant edge here for the Texas offense. But, why is it an edge? Well, I think it starts up front. This is a Texas offensive line that from a majority of the season, when they're not playing Georgia on the other side, has been above expectation. We expected it to be one of the better offensive lines for most of the season. It has been, outside of the Georgia game, where they've actually getting dominated in both of those games. I think part of the reason they got dominated in the game, in the SEC championship game, is their top player, their left tackle, Calvin Banks, didn't play in that game. We're talking about maybe even the first offensive tackle taken in the upcoming draft. This is a guy that's, third among FBS tackles and wins above average pass blocking grade. He's only surrendered pressure on 1.5% of his pass blocking snaps. Ankle injury, which is a concern, especially when you're dealing on the perimeter as far as blocking. But you would think with a couple extra weeks to rest up, he should be good to go. He is going to play. We'll just see how close to 100% he is. I thought the run game was starting to figure some things out for Texas. You looked at Wisner against Kentucky and A&M, became the workhorse. And then again, Georgia just destroyed all of that. 60 in the 2 games against Georgia, 60 rushing yards on 55 carries. 2 games against Georgia, 13 sacks. 15 sacks allowed in the other 11 games combined. The good news for Texas is you kind of mentioned it. This is not a typical Clemson, top 10, top 5 type of stop unit nationally. It's in fact, statistically, it's the worst Clemson defense in more than a decade. Basic metrics, you look at yards per play, yards per game, points per game, not in the top 40 in any of those. More advanced metrics, a little bit better, but not by much. Defensive success rate, number 36, not in the top 20 in EPA per rush or EPA per drop back. And when you add in the fact that I don't think they've necessarily played an elite schedule of opposing offenses, I have some concerns here about this Clemson defense. The one thing they have done well, in fact, they've done 2 things well. They're opportunistic. They're part of the reason Clemson's got the second best turnover margin in the country. They're above average in creating negative plays and sacks, and it starts up front with TJ Parker at edge. He's their highest graded defender, 49 pressures, 12 sacks, both in the top 15 in those 2 metrics. They have some other guys up front that at least look the part. Peter Woods at defensive tackle. Linebacker Barrett Carter leads the team in tackles, but I thought been a kind of a disappointment this season. Expectation was this guy was going to be a first or second team All-American. Hasn't played that, but the guy that's kind of stepped up a little bit and played like an All-American, at least a true freshman All-American, has been Sammy Brown, who's lived up to his 5-star status. 9 tackles for loss, 22 run stops. That's first among all true freshmen in both categories there. The concern and why I think there should be, regardless of how Ewers is playing in this game for Texas offense, I think there should be an Arch Manning package, because what has Clemson struggled against? Mobile quarterbacks. Even the Stanford game, you look at the score and you think, they dominated the game. They didn't. Stanford moved up and down the field. There was turnovers. Stanford over 200 rushing yards in that game. Just a couple weeks ago, South Carolina, Lenore Sellers running all over them, obviously won the game for them with his scrambling ability. Kevin Jennings in the ACC championship game, late in that one, scrambling, creating some plays. So Ewers obviously hasn't been very mobile with the ankle injury. I don't need to see Arch Manning for 35, 40 snaps, but I'm wondering if he gets a little bit of a package here to keep the Clemson defense on their heels. I also say Wes Goodwin. I like him, but obviously I think over the last few years he's proven to be a clear downgrade from Brent Venables. I don't see the exotics as much as the mixing and matching of the blitz packages that Venables had. Again, I go back to what I said at the start. If Ewers plays clean and they take advantage in the red zone, I think Texas is going to have their way here offensively.
If Texas has an opportunity, Payne, to have a path on the offensive side of the ball, this seems to be a little bit of a mismatch as well. For Clemson offensively, matched up against the Longhorns defense that has been the common denominator for this group all season. Clemson, Cade Klubnik deserves a ton of credit. He's shown flashes of the kind of quarterback that I think a lot of us were led to believe in what he was capable of producing. 40 touchdowns that he's been responsible for this season, 3rd in the FBS, had a strong performance in the ACC title, and has been forced to take on a little bit more of a running burden as Clemson's backfield continues to deal with a rash of injuries, opt-outs, and while Phil Maffa may be a little bit healthier here with a couple of weeks to heal up, the Clemson coaches haven't held back that he's going to need shoulder surgery once the season is over. And as far as what Clemson has for weapons on the outside, whether it's Bryant Wesco, Antonio Williams, Jake Brittingstuhl at tight end, this Texas defense is going to pose all sorts of challenges with their speed, their physicality, and their athleticism, and a familiar face that patrols that defensive backfield that I'm sure would love nothing more than to go out there and have a strong performance in Clemson transfer Andrew Makuba.
So there's a few things, and I give Cade Klubnik all the credit in the world.
The mute button helps there, pal.
I give Cade Klubnik all the credit in the world because he has improved his game. He's cut down on the turnovers. You do start to look at the schedule, and Georgia's defense had its way. Pittsburgh's defense showed extremely well. South Carolina's defense showed extremely well. Everyone throughout the ACC, though, Florida State's defense was down, NC State's defense was down, Louisville's defense was down, and so this is a massive step up in class. The other thing that was really interesting to me in digging, and you have to go back to 2022, Garrett Riley was the hottest offensive coordinator on planet Earth, leading TCU to the national championship. But along that run, he faced a far less complete Texas defense with Pete Kwiatkowski, and they couldn't do anything. TCU had 17 points in that game. 7 came on a Keandre Miller 75-yard explosive run. 10 points through 47 minutes and a 23% success rate at halftime. Negative EPA per play when it was all said and done for Garrett Riley and TCU's offense. We know Pete Kwiatkowski's defenses are built to have a better chance stopping spread offenses. He's kind of one of the patriarchs of this style of defense, built to stop these new school offenses. I don't know how Clemson finds consistent offense. If they have success, to your point, Todd, it's because Phil Maffa gets back on track and has a day running physically inside. We've talked a few times earlier in the season about Texas being a touch soft inside up front. They have been better down the stretch in that area. Top 30 in defensive line yards allowed this season. Top 20 in yards allowed per rush before first contact. Clemson's offensive line is not going to be confused for an elite unit. But, Phil Maffa hasn't been as good as Clemson fans would have hoped moving to a full-time role. I know the 1,100 rushing yards looks gaudy. It looks great, but he's been battling through some nagging injuries. It takes a while for him to get going. He's only forced a missed tackle on 15% of runs. He's 186th out of 200 qualifying running backs in elusiveness. Maffa's in the 9th percentile of all running backs when you hit him at or behind the line of scrimmage. And Texas is a top 5 defensive line in havoc created. So you need Maffa here. Cade Klubnik's legs have been a real factor. I believe you mentioned at the top, returning home, so a bit of a homecoming. We've seen how pivotal that's been in some of these key games, right? He had 4 10-plus yard runs against South Carolina, 5 10-plus yard runs against Wake, the 50-yard explosive TD to beat Pittsburgh. He had the 40-yard explosive that changed some things in the Va Tech game. But the Longhorns defense is built on speed. They got a glimpse of that with Marcel Reed a few weeks back. Anthony Hill is a rangy linebacker. Andrew Makuba, who you were hinting at, is an absolute assassin, especially in the Georgia game. If I was Makuba, this is kind of how I'm built, I would have sent postcards to Klubnik's house, his girlfriend's house, the Clemson facility. I would have just had a still shot of Gunnar Stockton laid out with a "See you December 1st" and a smiley face. Make Klubnik think twice before taking off and running in this game. There's also been some conversations about Makuba's presence past the physical side of the game. He's seen this Garrett Riley offense at practice every day for a full season. I would envision that helps getting guys lined up, maybe calling out a key player or two that he knows is coming. This isn't like Garrett Riley's offense isn't overly sophisticated. And so I think there's some interesting stuff there. But if Clemson finds its ground game here, you have a solid pressure outfit in Texas. They get after the quarterback on passing downs. They convert pressures to sacks extremely well. And the Horned secondary has been one of the biggest surprises of the season. Top 10 in success rate allowed, EPA per pass allowed, and explosiveness allowed. So if Maffa can't get going, if Klubnik isn't a massive factor on the ground, it becomes a little more interesting here. I would think the approach is to get the ball out of Klubnik's hands quickly. I would say it's not a massive hole, but certainly Texas's pass defense ticks down a little bit of a notch if you can get the ball out quickly and find some success in the short areas. And maybe that's a little bit of the saving grace. I'm finding it difficult when I look at the top defenses on Clemson's schedule, giving them a very difficult time, and Texas having a defense specifically built to stop this kind of offense with extra time to prepare, not having a good-sized advantage here, Todd.
It's such an interesting game because I think if you're going through trying to identify which unit you have the most confidence in, it's got to be Texas on the defensive side, especially after listening to you guys talk. But there's such a wide range of outcomes for the other three groups that'll dictate a cover, because even if Texas's defense is airtight and Texas settles for field goal, like Brad alluded to, like we've seen so many times from the Longhorns this year, makes it extremely difficult to go out there and not just win, but to win by margin in this particular spot. So with such a big number, handicap a little bit more like a regular season game than a postseason matchup. Interesting to see some under money coming in, given all of the questions that we have about what Clemson may or may not be on the defensive side when their feet are put to the fire on Saturday afternoon in Austin. You can follow Brad on social media at BradPower7. All sorts of great college football content, not just around the playoff games that we'll cover in great detail around these parts, but all the second, third, and maybe even the fourth tier bowl games that are out there from now, taking you through the new year. You can follow Payne there as well at Payne Insider. I'm, of course, Todd Fuhrman. But most importantly, be sure to follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod for all of the holiday schedule updates, whether it's the NFL you're after, college football, as there will be some tweaks given the way the holidays will fall over the next couple of weeks. And gentlemen, the last game that we'll see of the opening weekend of the college football playoff is in Columbus under the lights at Ohio Stadium, as we're trying to figure out what the weather forecast may be in Columbus for kickoff in this game. Seeing some under money come in here on a Wednesday morning. Ohio State's kind of 7.5. We'll call it 7.25 for argument's sake. Total now down to 46, painted across the board. There are some 46.5. That aforementioned forecast calls for 25 degrees at kickoff, with the temperature dropping throughout the game. For now, there's no snow in the forecast. Temperatures in Knoxville have been comparable to Columbus, Ohio, and Payne, friend of the show, did let me know that Knoxville isn't exactly warm and tropical this time of year when I question the toughness and the cold weather conditions that the players may have to go through with outdoor practice. But we'll see. It was 58 degrees when they were practicing outside on Tuesday, so a little bit different. Second ever meeting played between these programs. The only other one came in the Citrus Bowl. It was Peyton Manning on one side and Eddie George on the other. Ohio State actually hosting an SEC team for the first time since 1988 when they took on the LSU Tigers, won that game 36-33. It's a matchup between two of the top four scoring defenses in the FBS entering bowl season, and the first ever game played at Ohio Stadium during the month of December. Brad, Tennessee offensively, they closed the year strong, surpassing 450 yards in 4 of their final 5 games as the postseason push intensified, but there is some noise in the numbers. The opponents that the Vols were able to do that against, Vanderbilt, Utah, Mississippi State, and Kentucky. Against Georgia, they barely eclipsed 300 yards. Nico Maliava showed flashes of his command for the offense, but may not have all of his weapons at his disposal. Tennessee extremely banged up at the wide receiver position. 3 of their players wearing red non-contact jerseys in practice on Tuesday, and an even bigger deal when 4 of the 10 scholarship wide receivers have already entered the portal, and the coaching staff has said won't be available. But Dylan Sampson did say he would be the healthiest he's been after taking on a full workload in the backfield. Against the Buckeyes defense, that we can say what we want about how the offense performed against Michigan, it wasn't the defense's fault, as they held the Wolverines in check, much like they've done against pretty much everyone else. And whether it's efficiency numbers or counting stats hereafter, Jim Knowles has this veteran-laden group ready to go and should be primed for a good spot against the Tennessee offense that wants to operate in space.
Yeah, we got an edge here, obviously, to Ohio State's defense here. But we'll see how big it can possibly be here. But starting with Tennessee's offense, obviously, you mentioned it, noise in their numbers, and noise being, let's compare, quality or lack thereof of opposition, because against a very weak non-conference schedule, looked like the best offense in the country, averaging nearly 600 yards per game, 62 points per game, rush offense over 300, nearly 7 yards per carry against the SEC schedule. And you mentioned it wasn't necessarily the most difficult SEC slate of opponents outside of Alabama and Georgia. Tennessee's offense only averaged 25 points per game, less than 400 yards per game. Run game was certainly not as effective. They averaged 2.5 yards per carry less than they did in non-conference action. So obviously Ohio State's is good, if not better than any defense that they've seen so far this season. Iamaleava, certainly incredible high expectations for him coming in.
By the way, you say that much better, and it flows off your tongue much more appropriately than it does mine, Brad. So job well done.
I do 3 weekly hits in Nashville, and I actually practiced it this offseason. So I'm not lying.
I respect its commitment to the craft, because I still can't pronounce the quarterback for Penn State correctly without their fan base getting in our mentions on a regular basis.
Yeah, they even do to me, too. It's unbelievable. I blame the recruiting services. A couple of recruiting services, when he's being recruited out of high school, and we're talking to Penn State quarterback, they mispronounced it, and then I just got it in my head on how to pronounce it. But damn them.
Is it Alar or Aller? Which one is it? I still don't know.
I think it's Aller, but again, I've watched the multiple Penn State football games, and I feel like each broadcast crew says it differently.
They've said it different. Drew, the quarterback, Drew for Penn State, the starter from Ohio. Iamaleava, it does roll off the tongue, and actually it's pronounced exactly how it's spelled, so that helps too. One thing I'll say is he's protected the football at least. Only 5 picks this year, but certainly, hasn't been the big play explosives like you'd expect. The offense you were thinking was going to be like the Tennessee offense from 2 years ago. Is it as bad as what it was as far as an inconsistency that we saw from Milton last year? No, it's been a little bit better than that. And I think the main reason is obviously there were some concerns because you lost 2 of the 3 running backs from last season that were productive. And Dylan Sampson said, you know what, I can handle the workload. And he's had one of the better rushing seasons that we've seen in recent SEC history here, for nearly 1,500 yards, 22 touchdowns, super productive, and he's run behind an offensive line from Tennessee that I don't think is that great. In fact, not a single starting offensive lineman for Tennessee has an overall grade, above 70 for them. If you're looking at the PFF grades, I know that leave a little bit to be desired when it comes to offensive line, but still, they've been banged up on the offensive line. They don't get an incredible push there, despite the fact that their offense with the wide splits, kind of creates some running lanes, but Sampson's lived up to expectations. Dante Thornton's their big play threat when they can get him the football, number 1 in the country in yards per catch. Ultimately, this is going to sound like some of the other simple handicaps that we have for the playoffs here. They got to be able to establish a run with Sampson. If he can get some running lanes there, keep it simple for Nico, hit a big play to Thornton, or get a pass interference on Igbinosun, which he's obviously capable of doing multiple times in the game, that'll put a little bit of pressure on Ohio State's offense. But the Ohio State defense, certainly the strength of the team. Oregon moved the football on them. No one else really has, and certainly to me, obviously Tennessee's not Oregon when it comes to the multitude of weapons at running back, wide receiver, and the experience at quarterback. Just all Oregon's better than Tennessee in all those edges. I will say this: I'm going to push back a little bit on you, Todd.
All right, I like it. I like pushback.
Instead of just agreement. I hear you overall on the Michigan performance by the Ohio State defense. You should win a football game when you give up 13 points. But I got to tell you, late in that game, they gave up a season-high 172 rushing yards. And when it came to winning time, just like last year in 3 big games and just like against Oregon, this defense does not get a stop. Michigan's last 2 drives, 15 plays, 77 yards, 11 plays, 57 yards, burned up nearly 15 minutes time of possession in those 2 drives alone. And it's a Michigan team couldn't throw the football at all, 62 passing yards, and they couldn't get a stop when they needed it most. Michigan ran the football like they had the previous 3 years on them. So I still, statistically, we're talking about the number 1 total defense, the number 1 scoring defense. And if the game is close in the 4th quarter and they got to get a stop, I still have some concerns there, like I did coming into the season. But from a talent aspect, Jack Sawyer and JTT have arguably their best seasons in their Ohio State careers. Cody Simon's been super productive. You might have the best safety combo in the country, 1-2 punch of Downs and Ransom. So, they have the edge here. I would like to see when you talk about, off the field, scenarios here. I thought Herbie, for a change, made a great point. I think vital to this game is Ohio State to get off to a good start. If they're struggling early, particularly on Payne's side of the ball, Will the crowd turn on Ohio State? And I think it would be beneficial with all the doubt with Ryan Day and whatnot. If this is a close game late, I actually think, outside of the home, this might be the rare instance where the visiting team might have a slight edge here, just because of the psychology of what Ohio State's gone through with their home crowd since the Michigan game.
Payne, does Ohio State have a path to kind of bounce back offensively? I mean, Chip Kelly taking responsibility in the wake of that lackluster performance against Michigan in the regular season finale. We can call it rock bottom for the Buckeyes, as it was the fewest points they'd scored in a regular season game since 2011, a contest they lost to Michigan State 10-7, 0 points in the second half. It was the first scoreless regular season half since 2014. At Penn State, we know Will Howard will need to bounce back. They'll try and do everything they can to get the ball to where they have an edge on the outside with a Jeremiah Smith, Ibuka, Carnell Tate against the Tennessee secondary. That is probably the biggest weakness that the Vols defense possesses. We know Tennessee is stout in the trenches, but Ohio State hasn't exactly been the model of efficiency when it comes to running the football. Ohio State's offense against the Tennessee defense, what are you looking for to see who can just create an advantage for them in a game of this magnitude?
Points.
Points tend to go a long way for an offense. I would echo those sentiments.
You touched on the big talking point since Ohio State's embarrassing loss to Michigan was Chip Kelly's play calling. It was too run heavy, continually running right at Mason Graham while you have a backup center, not getting the ball to playmakers on the outside. There has to be change in this game, but how much of it will you see, right? Like when you hire Chip Kelly, you understand he wants to run the ball. When you go out and break the bank for Judkins to pair with Henderson, it confirms that style. When you're without your starting center and left tackle and your quarterback has 13 turnover-worthy plays on the season and you view your defense as being the best in the country, it's not surprising to go with a low-variance approach. Chip Kelly talked to the media this week for the first time since the Michigan game. He openly admitted needing to do a better job getting the ball to his playmakers on the outside. That those are the team's biggest difference makers, right? It sounds encouraging. Did you actually listen to Ryan Day's presser this week? He ends it with a gem. We are a different offense than we were 3 weeks ago, 5 weeks ago at the beginning of the season. I think we have to recognize that. To me, it insinuates the offensive line has caused them to go more run heavy, that they don't trust their pass blocking, and it's who Ohio State is right now. So I think there's some variance within the game plan and approach, and if you do build a lead, do they then sit on it to where it leaves potentially the back door open for Tennessee? On paper, it's the chicken or the egg, right? The biggest matchup in this game is Tennessee's defensive line against a makeshift Ohio State offensive line. That's making another change to the starting five. It sounds like the Buckeyes are starting Luke Montgomery at left guard in this game. They've had 3 weeks to get him ramped up. He's only got 77 snaps on the season, but he's a top 100 player in the 2023 class. He was the number 2 player in the state of Ohio. He is now the starting left guard. So you're looking at another starting lineup for this Buckeyes offense up front. Can Ohio State's offensive line create enough room for a balanced attack? Can they hold up in pass pro if Ohio State comes out with that more aggressive game plan throwing? Tennessee's done a really good job up front. They haven't been as dominant as they were early in the season, but they still finished top 20 in tackles for loss, defensive line yards allowed, rushing success rate, and EPA per rush allowed. So you would think to a degree it's going to be tough sledding for the ground game. I just don't think it's in Chip Kelly's MO to completely go away from it. The Vols front has been good creating pressure, top 25 in the country, but they've struggled converting those pressures into sacks, outside the top 70 in sack conversion rate. And while Will Howard isn't elite, one of his better attributes has been avoiding pressure, just a 12% pressure to sack rate. However, the idea of pressure, and even when Howard avoids it, he hasn't been great throwing with pressure. One big-time throw all season, 6 turnover-worthy plays when pressured. He's graded out quarterback 86 out of 162 qualifiers when he's under duress. In theory, if Howard plays well, if Ohio State can protect slightly better than we think, if Chip Kelly can keep the Vols defense on their heels, create some quick wins on the outside, Ohio State should be able to attack the Vols secondary if they have time. You mentioned that. Outside the top 75, an explosive pass rate allowed. It's the ultimate chicken or the egg. I would love to see We have questions about the Vols linebacker core. It's been decimated by injury on top of that. Can we get Travion Henderson matched up on some linebackers? I mean, get him in the slot, line him. I mean, that's got to be the key to this game is really attacking the middle of the field and doing it somewhat quickly, right? Shotgun, we're getting the ball out in 2.5 seconds. Whoever the guy in our slot is just dominating the linebackers. And that, to me, is a little bit of the path. Getting Travion Henderson out in wheel routes on these linebackers. It doesn't necessarily have to be this 3.5-second drop, find the deep explosive to Jeremiah Smith and hope and pray your offensive line holds up. You can do some things in the throw game creatively to avoid some of that pressure that Pierce probably inevitably gets here if you're attempting to go with that style of passing attack. So this needs to look a lot more buttoned up when you have a Chip Kelly mind, when you have a Ryan Day offensive mind. Your hope is that with 3 weeks, you can come up with something here that doesn't render your offense relatively useless, just trying to run the ball up the middle with a backup center kind of paving the way.
Fascinating chess match for two teams that clearly, with a slightly more favorable road, could be considered bet-on teams, but matching up against one another with a big number at stake here. We'll see how the market goes, and that'll be the final question that I'll throw to either of you gentlemen on this game. I mean, 7.5 trending towards a juice 7 at some prominent shops and not so prominent shops. Do we get to 7 flat? Do we see a wave of support for the Buckeyes? I mean, when you guys rub those infamous crystal balls, what do you think we see in terms of game day movement or in the 24 hours leading up to kickoff for what will be the proverbial get-out game for bookmakers, knowing they have 3 college football games that day along with 2 NFL games, and they'll no doubt need at least one of those underdogs to get to the window, probably outright to blow up some of those teasers and money parlay liability.
It's happening right now as we discuss this game. There's some under money coming into the market. We're at 45.5 at some shops, and we've seen a couple come off the 7.5, and we're down to 7 now. So I don't know, Brad, what your thoughts are on where this goes from here, but it's there is some money coming in as we actually discuss it right now.
I think it's probably much more likely to close 7 than at 7.5. I think it's the rare underdog that the public will probably support because they're going to go off of what they just saw last, and that was one of the most highly watched games was Ohio State losing outright. I don't think there's much faith that even among the Ohio State supporters wanting to even bet their home team Ohio State. So I expect Tennessee to get some of the more of the public action than usual on underdog. With that being said, I know that some people that wouldn't mind betting Ohio State at a flat 7 or maybe get greedy. I've always said all year.
Yeah.
Wait, be patient. If you don't see the number you like, wait, you might see it.
Yeah. If I don't think this can get to 6.5, but if it does. Certainly,
I don't think it'll last long.
No, certainly some intrigue there for sure.
I don't think it'll last long if it does get there, for no doubt. To your point, Brad, one of the underdogs catching an awful lot of buzz in terms of checking a number of boxes, and I won't quite say it's an apples-to-apples comparison for Tennessee's trip to Georgia, but a little bit of buyer beware when it comes to the Vols and why this number opened a shade more than a touchdown. That's not all, though, gentlemen. I mean, there are still a bevy of other bowl games to try and be dissected, digested, discussed, but we don't have time to try and get through everything here. So BP, the world is your oyster, kind sir. Is there a bowl bet that stands out to you that'll get kicked off before we reconvene to break down the quarterfinal matchups, or one where you believe the number will be on the move?
Yeah, we're going to go all the way to December 28th. So obviously, we're looking at peering into the future here, and obviously, bowl season has become more of an uncertainty than ever before. Who's playing, who isn't, who's opting out. I personally have changed my philosophy where, when there's so much uncertainty, what do I want to bet? I mean, how many times when you see starting quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, skill position players, when they're out, what happens? Well, obviously, depending on who it is, the side's going to move drastically. What I haven't seen moved aggressively in some of these opt-outs is the total. and we're going to take advantage of an under here for a variety of reasons. We're going to go to December 28th. It's the Fenway Bowl in Boston, Massachusetts. We're going under 55, Connecticut, North Carolina. What do I see as far as the opt-outs? Well, I see North Carolina's by far best offensive weapon, Amarian Hampton, at running back. He's declared for the NFL draft. Most likely will not play in this game. That moved the side moved a couple of points, in Connecticut's favor, but we didn't see much movement on the total. On the other side, Connecticut, one of their top running backs, Terrell Robinson, is off to Auburn. So that's another weapon for them gone. You also look at Connecticut might have some issues as far as their offensive line with injuries and possible opt-outs there. So will they be running as efficient? There's a little bit of noise in their stats when they step down in class against the Massachusetts and the Merrimacks of the world. Offense put up significant big numbers. When it had to step up in class, offense not as efficient. I think there's a big outlier and some noise in North Carolina's full season stats, that being the one game against James Madison where there was 120 points scored and the game went over the total by 72 points. You take that, back that game out of the stats, and hell, their average season, total points in a game, 55. That's where we're at, 55. Take out Hampton, take out some other offensive weapons, and I think the other factor that people don't think about enough, obviously when you're doing bowl game because you're thinking warm weather, Fenway Park, makeshift field, could be some weather. We were in Boston last December. Weather forecast said one thing, ended up being a different thing in a matter of a couple of hours. So let's take advantage of all that, and let's go under 55 Fenway Bowl, Connecticut, North Carolina.
Love to hear it. Take advantage. Early kickoff as well, 11 o'clock Eastern on a Saturday morning on the 28th. We'll see if those teams can be a little bit sluggish in that particular spot. You do wonder if Bill Belichick will be in attendance, the new head coach at North Carolina, coming back to his Boston roots to try and shake hands and wave to the masses in that environment. But we're not officially done. Still have best bet territory to get to, and more on that in a moment. All right, my good man, it is best bet portion of the program, a limited slate as we wanted to try and isolate some of the wagering and investment opportunities to the four marquee games. We let Brad go a little bit off the radar, getting our money in good early for the Fenway Bowl on December 28th. But in terms of the college football playoff, we know these markets are efficient. We know they've been on the board, and surprisingly, there hasn't been a hell of a lot of movement other than Indiana taking some money, pushing it down to the key. So from a best bet standpoint, side, total, derivative, what do we have in store for our listeners?
Yeah, I think you hit it perfectly in that these lines have not seen a ton of movement at this point, and they've kind of been floating around some key numbers. We had some back and forth on the Clemson-Texas game. If you told me Texas is going to finish their drives, I think they roll Clemson, but that's obviously a big if. This clearly isn't a massive bet by any stretch, but listening to Brad break down Tennessee's offense against Ohio State's defense, and Jim Knowles is a guy that we have a ton of respect for, especially crafting game plans. I think there is a real edge there with Ohio State's defensive line, and I've been a guy who thinks that defensive line maybe is a touch overrated, but the Vols' offensive line leaves a little bit to be desired if you can contain the ground game. You mentioned some of the injury issues that Tennessee's had with their pass catchers. I believe all of the three pass catchers that you listed as being red non-contact jerseys are going to
differing
play,
levels of overall health for that trio.
Yes, but certainly none of those guys are 100%. You mentioned some of the depth guys opting out, 4 of those gentlemen. And then, I'm not big on the whole weather thing, right? I think it plays a role, but there are other elements in which bucket you place them in. And I think, our listeners that cross over and listen to the NFL, right? Tua weather, to me, wasn't a thing, but it was more of a bucket in terms of playing upper echelon teams, which the Packers were. We saw Tua go out there. But you do have a gentleman in Nico who's from Long Beach, California, and it's going to be frigid cold there at Ohio State. So I think that plays a little bit of a role here. Let's go to the derivative market. Let's go Tennessee team total under 19.5 points scored. Again, it's not a big bet, and because it's a derivative, you couldn't get a big bet down if you wanted one, but just a little action for the college football playoff games, which seem pretty tight. I mean, I have not heard a massive stance taken to this point. But again, we are in no man's land on a Wednesday. But Todd, we were talking a little bit off air with these games being out for so long. I just assume there might be a little bit of maybe an expedited position taken early in the week because they had been out for so long, but we haven't seen that.
There hasn't been much in the way of movement whatsoever. I think what is interesting when we look at the Ohio State defense, and you mentioned Jim Knowles, more or less said he's going to let Larry Johnson continue to handle the defensive line and how those snaps get distributed. But one thing that did come out is Ohio State said against Michigan that their defensive linemen, and Brad kind of alluded to, started to wear down late in that game. So I would expect them to be slightly more aggressive with their rotations, keep some of those bodies fresh. And as you dig into some of the other numbers that we didn't share and we broke down Ohio State defensively, Ohio State playing 8 men in the box, they have not given up a rushing touchdown when they have 8 defenders in the box. Sampson has the most rushing touchdowns in all of the FBS when facing 8 defenders, so we'll see that particular chess match. The other thing against Ohio State, and I think you brought up an excellent point off the air, as you try and go through Ohio State defensively, have they played a passing attack this dynamic since Oregon? The resounding answer is no, but they've done what you would want a top-tier defense to do. They haven't given up a passing touchdown since Dylan Gabriel had 2 in the Buckeyes' 32-31 loss at Oregon on October 12th. That's a 6-game streak without allowing a passing touchdown, the longest active streak in the FBS. No other team in the country has gone more than 2 games. Look, Tennessee's going to try and hit the explosive or two. Maybe the cold weather slows them down some, but with those receivers banged up, Ohio State having a little bit of chance to prepare for pace and tempo, I think the Buckeyes' defense will be entrenched, mainly because they may not have enough confidence in their offense to get enough points on the board and be able to run away and hide.
It's certainly a different conversation as well, going to Autzen, playing Oregon in that passing attack when they had Tez, and we saw what Oregon just did, lighting up Penn State's defense. I think maybe when we envision Tennessee's offense, you're putting them more in a tier of Indiana offense, Penn State offense, and that might be kind. And we saw what Ohio State's defense did against that tier of offense. Penn State had 13.7. We're on a pick 6 offensive points. Indiana held to 15 in this very building. So I'm not putting Tennessee's offense in the class of Oregon. It would kind of more reside in the area of Penn State and Indiana, and I think even then you're giving yourself some leeway.
Agree completely on all of that. So it's the Tennessee Volunteers team total under 19.5. Again, not a big bet. The best of what's available on the board for the 4 playoff games to allow all of you, our loyal listeners, to have some action on the marquee games this weekend. Anything else you'd like to share, kind sir? Any packing tips you'd like to offer for heading into the frigid elements?
No, nothing.
All right.
That's it. Let's get out of here. We're approaching an hour and a half.
On that note, we will be back tomorrow with a little NFL discussion, a couple of marquee games between the Eagles and Commanders, and, of course, the Thursday night showdown in the AFC West between the Chargers and Broncos. Before Brad Powers, Payne Insider, I'm Todd Fuhrman. Best of luck with all of your bowl and playoff investments, and with a Tennessee team total ticket in that portfolio, we'll see you at the window.
We hope you enjoyed listening to this episode of Bet the Board. Make sure you follow Todd and Payne on X. Todd is at Todd Fuhrman. That's TODDFUHRMAN. And Payne is at Payne Insider. That's PAYNEINSIDER. Don't forget, our weekly newsletter comes with an additional best bet. Have that delivered to your inbox by clicking the link atop the podcast show notes. And most importantly, subscribe and download Bet the Board. We're on Apple, Spotify, Amazon Wondery, YouTube, Google Podcasts, and all your other major platforms.